All right, so we want to turn back to a story that we've been following all morning long. The Trump campaign manager, Brad Parscale, has been demoted and replaced. So we want to bring in CBS News political contributor Leslie Sanchez to talk a little bit more about this. Leslie, you're a go-to person when we're talking about the Republican Party, and I know some people have kind of described this as a surprise shakeup. But was it a surprise shakeup from what you've been hearing?
Actually, on the ground, I think there's a tremendous consensus that Brad was going to go. A lot of that, Anne-Marie, started percolating after the Tulsa fiasco when the president was anticipating 1 million people wanted to come to his event. And you found out that through a lot of social media hacks on TikTok, Brad Parscale's kind of development, what he was promoting for the president in terms of digital outreach and competitiveness was completely false. And after that, it really started a snowball effect. It's not uncommon to see a change, but the axe always falls on the leadership.
So one constant throughout President Trump's time in office, Leslie, is Jared Kushner. Brad Parscale was associated with the Kushner family. The president had talked about Jared Kushner as having a portfolio that included bringing peace to the Middle East, all sorts of things that Jared was going to be doing. We haven't seen any of that transpire. So I guess my question is, what role has he been playing for the reelection campaign? And is it changing now that Parscale has been replaced?
A lot of people internally will believe that definitely Kushner has his fingerprints on the transition and on the change.
Things to think about. It's not unusual for the campaign to change. Trump did that almost this exact time in the 2016 campaign with Corey Lewandowski, removed him out of the way internally. What is consistent between 2016 and what we're seeing today is the Trump family, just like in many other cases of presidential campaigns, influence the president in ways that actually, push him to make these decisions. Whether Jared was in there saying we needed a change of pace, let me tell you, they are looking at the same tea leaves, the same political outcomes that I'm looking at and anybody else who's kind of following this closely. Trump is in tremendous trouble with this election for a variety of different reasons. And what tends to happen, people move things around, the family puts a lot of pressure, you see the friction, it's leaked in the press, and now we see the change. But I want to point to, Vlad, just a real important data point that came out this week. It was a new NBC Wall Street Journal poll of registered voters, which is what we're following, very comparable to what we see in our own internal polling, that shows that 72% of the country, of these registered voters, want a change in direction. Historically, anytime it's over 60%, you're going to see a change at the top. That's a really significant number that campaign operatives pay attention to. To be in the 70s just shows you how dire a situation it is and how the Trump campaign is trying to get a hold of it.
Okay, so let's dig in a little bit to those numbers. You've seen the polling, showing that Joe Biden has, a pretty significant lead in a number of states, including some battleground states, over the president. But, when we think back to 2016, there was a lot of polling indicating that Hillary Clinton was leading Donald Trump, and didn't turn out to be the case. I'm wondering, what are some of the key numbers that you see, and, the president often points to his own internal polling that he often says is different than the polling that the general public is seeing. So I'm wondering, what you're seeing, because you're an insider.
Sure. There's a tremendous disconnect in what you hear about externally and what the Trump campaign is looking at. I haven't seen it myself, but I will tell you it's a hybrid approach. It has some analytics, it has some AI looking at all the data profile of these voters, and they're constantly recalibrating to figure out where they can close the gap in competitive key electoral states. The challenge is when the data is flawed, when the data can be manipulated, as in the case of the Tulsa rally, when you had people sign up that weren't necessarily interested in supporting the Trump campaign. It changes the formula, and you realize you're dealing with false numbers. That's where the Trump campaign is right now. So if you look at just traditional polling, if the president, if the country is looking at 72% want a change in direction, that's a significant area that we talked about. that is going to really force a lot of the change you're seeing right now.
So I love when we have you on, Leslie, to talk about the numbers as opposed to some of the political arguments that people are making on the left or the right. There's some Monmouth polling right now that I thought was really sort of intriguing. And I'm not a pollster and I'm terrible at math, but let me see if I can understand this and have you put it into context for our viewers. There's been a lot made by the president and other folks about, and I think Anne-Marie pointed this out earlier in our discussion with Major Garrett and Nicole Skanga, of these secret Trump supporters, right? That people are not talking to pollsters about voting for President Trump for a variety of reasons. No one, according to this Monmouth poll, believes that there are secret Biden supporters, right? If you're voting for Vice President Biden, you're pretty upfront about that. But there does remain a significant fear of what Anne-Marie pointed to, which is that several polls missed the Trump surge in the 2016 election, except that this poll shows that that's not really the case in some of those battleground states. Unlike in Michigan, in Wisconsin and in Pennsylvania, the polling in 2016 was actually not off that far from where it actually ended up. According to Real Clear Politics, average polling in that state gave Hillary Clinton a 2 percentage point lead. That's far from certain. So polling wasn't necessarily wrong, but there is this perception now amongst the electorate that, you know what, you've got to vote because there are these secret Trump supporters and we can miss it the same way we missed it in 2016.
So Vlad, I love when you bring that up because historically you're right. Over the course of several presidential elections, increasingly people in the social science research, in polling, believe that traditional polling is flawed as we see it for a variety of different reasons. And as it was escalating from 2012, Mitt Romney thought he was going to win, and you move over, people look at their internal daily tracking. That's really where they have a very good sense. What happened with Trump, you had so many non-traditional voters or maybe soft Democrats who really liked Trump but didn't really engage traditionally in the process. And there was this undercurrent of suspicion about the establishment in any way. So they were told, do not talk to exit polls, if you remember that, people that were measuring. There was no real calibration, no real understanding of where they were going to go. They were quietly really excited about the style and leadership of a potential candidacy of President Trump. That got a lot of them engaged that wouldn't normally get engaged. And we saw that. There's another thing, Vlad, that happened in 2016 you don't see happening now because you mentioned Joe Biden. Hillary Clinton had such tremendous negatives, extremely high negatives. If you look at the latest registered voting poll, I talk about NBC Wall Street Journal, Joe Biden's negatives for extreme are like in the 30s. So it's not great, but it's the binary choice. If you get to those two, those are some of the things that are shaping up for 2020 on top of a pandemic that are going to change potentially the outcome historically of this election.
So one more question for you about the down ballots and the Trump effect. That much has been made about the Trump effect during the midterm elections. What would it be? And now we're seeing, some really kind of significant down ballot races. I'm thinking about Jeff Sessions, who lost his party's nomination. The president campaigned against him pretty openly. Do we have any idea, as we look at some of these other races, what the Trump effect is at this point?
I think in competitive races, we're seeing consistently that you're having strong conservative-based candidates, maybe female in some cases, that are running on a strong conservative platform with their economic or social conservative issues, and they're not bringing up Trump. I can tell you particularly there are Latino conservatives that have now no longer calling themselves Latino Republicans in their PACs and in their fundraising. Now they're Latino conservatives, and they say we don't get involved in federal elections. There is a distancing, and it's happening rather rapidly from the Trump Republican Party. Some of that is the establishment, disgruntled folks who believe that we need to go back to normalcy. They don't like his petulant style and his leadership. A perfect example of that is the Lincoln Project, which is made up of Republicans, a lot of campaign operatives who are advising campaigns to distance themselves. And they did that hit job political ad against Brad Parscale a month ago, which now you can see whether it did or didn't. It could potentially have had an effect on changing the presidential leadership in the campaign. So it's a different ball game down ballot, and they're really looking at their local issues and their local state government.
Interesting stuff. Leslie Sanchez, we don't talk to you frequently enough. We miss you. But I'm glad we got to talk to you today.
I miss you guys. Sure. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you, Leslie.